Good morning and welcome to the fourth meeting of the COVID-19 Committee in 2021. We have received apologies from Monica Lennon, MSP, and Beatrice Wishart, MSP, and we are joined by Alec Rowley, MSP, and Willie Rennie, MSP, who are attending as committee substitutes. And can I welcome both Alec and Willie to this meeting. This morning, the committee will be taking evidence from the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, Europe and External Affairs, Michael Russell, MSP, and Professor Jason Leach, who is the National Clinical Director for the Scottish Government. This session gives members the opportunity to take evidence on this week's ministerial statement on COVID-19. The committee will also consider the following regulations: the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements Local Level Scotland Amendment Number 14 Regulations 2021, SSI 2021/35. Cabinet Secretary, can I welcome you to the meeting and can I invite you to make a brief opening statement?
Thank you, Convener. I'm pleased to be here again today to discuss the First Minister's latest statement to Parliament and to give evidence on a recent set of regulations. The First Minister covered a lot of ground in her statement to Parliament on Tuesday, and I don't intend to cover it all again, but I will remind the committee of some key points. As she set out, Cabinet has decided that the current lockdown, including the requirement to stay at home except for essential purposes, must remain in place until at least the end of February. It's positive news that the lockdown restrictions are working to improve the situation, but that makes it even more important for us to keep the restrictions in place at this time. That's essential so the NHS can cope with demand, to ensure that we don't see a sudden rise in cases by easing restrictions too early. The First Minister also set out our intention to see some children and young people return to education from the week beginning the 22nd of February. While this will not, of course, see an immediate return for all pupils, it will hopefully reduce some of the pressures that school closures are putting on pupils and parents. And a further update on both of these issues will be provided to Parliament in 2 weeks. Finally, the First Minister announced we intend to introduce a managed quarantine requirement for anyone who arrives directly into Scotland, regardless of which country they have come from. This change will take vital steps to guard against the importation of new COVID cases, and further details in that will be set out as soon as we are able to do so. Finally, the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements Local Level Scotland Amendment Number 14 regulations prohibit mortgage repossessions from taking place in level 3 or 4 areas, that is, throughout the whole of Scotland at present. These provisions will provide homeowners with similar protection as those in the rented housing sector. The key purpose in stopping mortgage repossessions at this time is to prevent households becoming at risk of homelessness and being forced to enter possibly multiple other households at a time when that is prohibited. These regulations came into force on the 23rd of January. I hope those brief comments are helpful. I'm happy, of course, as will Jason Leach be, to take and respond to your questions. And what we can't answer, of course, we'll endeavour to provide answers for you as soon as we can.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And if I could turn to questions now and remind members that we have approximately 8 minutes each for questions, so it would be helpful if we could keep both our questions and answers concise. And if there's time for supplementaries, I will indicate this once all members have had a chance to ask questions. I begin by asking a first question, and it's on the number 14 regulations that the Cabinet Secretary touched on at the end of his statement. I just wonder if he could provide just some further context about the policy reasons for bringing forward these regulations beyond what he's just said. What concerns in particular do they seek to address?
Well, mortgage repossession is clearly something that we would like to and intend to avoid, just as we've tried to avoid any actions that will produce homelessness. And I think I've indicated two sides of that. There's the obvious difficulty of people who find themselves in that position at this particular time, and very often because of circumstances that have been created by, for example, unemployment, by losing a job. But the second one is the knock-on effect of that, and I just touched on that in the regulations. People who would be made homeless will clearly and might well have to enter into multiple households to change their household arrangements, and that would be detrimental in terms of the type of thing that we're trying to avoid. So I think it is a measure that is not only correct in terms of the difficulties that people feel at this stage and experience at this stage, but is a measure to prevent unnecessary spread of the virus, as all these regulations are. And I think it meets both those objectives.
Thank you for that. Could I turn next to the issue of schools and returning to school? The First Minister on Tuesday spoke of primary 1 to primary 3 coming back on the 22nd of February. And obviously the implication of that is that years above primary 3 will not be coming back at that point in time. Now, I accept that the line has to be drawn somewhere, but can Jason Leach perhaps explain why is the line drawn there in particular? And secondly, is there a time frame for trialling this return to school? There's been talk of 3 weeks in some reports. Does the government have a set time frame for that return?
I certainly think Jason should address the first of those issues, certainly probably the second.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, everybody, again. Thank you for having me. I think there are two factors at play when we choose in our advice what to suggest should open. One is volume, and the second is how much harm there is to that group by not being open, whether that's the hospitality industry, the oil and gas sector, or schools. So in this occasion, it's pretty obvious. What we're worried about here is not 2-year-olds transmitting the virus. What we're worried about here is the adults around the 2-year-olds and the 7-year-olds and everything that causes. Now, that's partly at the gates of nursery or school or whatever, and partly staff in these institutions. We're much more worried about the virus in the parents and the carers attached to these groups rather than the kids themselves, because even new variant doesn't transmit well between children, and children don't get, in the main, serious illness. So therefore, it's a factor of how many and what the locations are for that. So in the primary schools, is it possible, therefore, to have the adults more distant because you don't have so many turning up? That's not an exact science, but the public health advice now, having learned what we've learned from around the world and from Scotland, is not to do it all at once. The second point there is how much harm there is. And all of the educational recovery group educationalists, not the public health advisors, say that the greatest harm is to the youngest children. And therefore, the well-being of that group is the first you should fix, if you possibly can. And that's why the education recovery group in the round took the public health advice for volume and the educationalist advice for harm to that group to try and bring them back. To your second point, Mr. Russell will want to say something about timing. I can tell you that the public health advice is you don't know what you have done for 3 weeks. It takes about 3 weeks because of the incubation period and the nature of this virus for you to know if you did X, Y will happen.
I'd simply echo that. I mean, I think any decision that is made is made with the intention of continuing that process, but clearly every process then is judged by the outcomes that we see. So we would want to make sure, and I've said at this committee before, last autumn I remember saying it, the ensuring that schools return to full functionality is something that we deeply wish to see. But we have to do this a step at a time, and we have to do it judging the outcomes as we see them.
Thanks for that. Just a couple of other, and I think they're quite brief questions, factual questions. In terms of the quarantining system, clearly that's under design at the moment, but could you give us any information about when it will come into operation?
I think there's an endeavour to try and get it in as soon as possible, but there's also an endeavour to try and get as much agreement as possible. I noticed the Welsh Government was saying, I think yesterday, that they would like to see not just a 4-country, but a 5-country approach to it, given the common travel area. So I can't give you an exact date. I don't know if Jason has anything from this morning's discussions, which clearly he would have been involved in. I haven't been involved in to see if there's any progress on that. But we will try and give that as soon as possible. There's also a need to ensure that we are discussing and listening to the views of travel, trade, of airports, of course, are crucial to this. All that has to be taken into account. But Jason may have some more up-to-date information.
Not on date, only on the public health advice is a 5-country solution would be the favoured solution. You can imagine why. I mean, it's not rocket science to work out that a 5-country solution, so therefore dealing with any access via Dublin from another country would be helpful to us. A 4-country solution, failing that, and failing that, a 1-country solution. I've said many times at this committee, it doesn't matter where your low prevalence area is. It could be just Dumfries and Galloway. It could be just the Western Isles. It could be Scotland. It could be the whole common travel area. You have to keep the virus out once you're at low levels. We do have a little bit of time for this because, unfortunately, we are presently exporting virus, not importing virus. Our prevalence is high. Denmark just closed to UK nationals. Other European countries are closing to UK nationals. It's not really a decision for us yet, but as we get this number down, it will become absolutely crucial that we do not import for a third wave.
Thank you for that. My final question, I think, is again for Jason Leach, and it's about the vaccine rollout in terms of invitations to the over 70s. Are you able to give a figure in terms of how many invitations have been sent out nationally to the over 70s at this point in time?
I'm not. I think I can probably get you that in terms of the hundreds of thousands that will have gone. I think we know that somewhere in the system just from the Royal Mail distribution centre. I can tell you that that group, everybody who wants one, and there will be some stragglers, of course, and there'll be people who have moved house, and there'll be people who need to contact us. Of course there will at the edge. But that group will be vaccinated by mid-February, and therefore they will all get their letters prior to that. So the vast majority of them will be this week, beginning of next week. Because of supply and the nature of the vaccination centres, we can't give as much notice as we'd like. I mean, we'd like to give 2 weeks' notice, everybody can arrange it and they can move their appointments around. So some of that will be a little bit just in time. But that group on track across the whole country to be done, along with the clinically extremely vulnerable, which is a group that encompasses all age groups of adults, done by mid-February. But I can get you the exact number of letters that, maybe not the exact number of letters, an estimate of the number of letters that have gone out.
I'd be very grateful for that. Thank you for those answers. Can I turn now to Alec Rowley for his questions? And Alec, could I ask you please to declare any relevant interests, if you have any, before you ask your questions?
Yeah, I prefer to my members' interests register. Thanks, convener. Can I ask first in terms of the approvals? It has been this week we've saw on the television the vaccine that's been approved, I think, in terms of Livingston, which is good news. Can I ask, in terms of vaccines coming on stream, is there hope there for more coming on stream? And the specific question around what happens with an approval, I assume the first couple of vaccines that were approved, there's massive processes to go through. Is that able to be speeded up? And can we expect more vaccines to be becoming available in the coming months?
Well, I think Jason is ideally placed to answer that. He has far more knowledge of all those things than I have. But it is interesting to note this week, for example, the peer review of the Sputnik V vaccine from Russia, and the fact that there's an international race, of course, and it's a race not against one country against another. It's a race against the virus. And it really is important that we remember that. This is a race against the virus, and there's a huge amount of effort and time going into doing it, and a lot of coverage. Far better place to talk in detail about this.
Thanks, Mr. Rowley. I think the basis of your question, the answer is yes. As time passes, we will get more vaccines approved. Let's be clear around approval and trials, though. There are only 2 vaccines approved for use in the UK presently. And they are the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine. Moderna will be next. Moderna's going through that process, but Moderna hasn't made enough vaccine for us to have any yet. They are anticipating supply in April. The Valvena vaccine, which is the one that Livingston is part of the manufacturing plant for, they're not actually making any yet. So it will come later on again, when we need hundreds of millions of doses for the UK and hundreds of millions of doses for the whole world. So there's a number of processes. The two pieces of good news this week were that the trial data from a couple of other vaccines, including the Sputnik Russian vaccine, were very good. And it would appear that the scientific community has nailed this vaccine for now. And they have found a way of making it effective. The difficulty is this is not making widgets. It takes about 3 months to make a vial of vaccine. The vial you see on the BBC News going round in a circle, that took 3 months to make it because of the nature of the manufacturing process. And you can't speed that up because that's about making virus and making the spike protein and all of the chemicals that need to do that. The approval bit, which is the other part of your question, is going at lightning pace, but we need to let the trials do their thing. We can't go quicker than injecting people with vaccine, checking their immunity, and waiting to see if they catch the virus. So there's just a natural timescale that has to pass, and phase 3 trials are now ongoing in those new vaccines. But I think if we're still doing this weekly in September and October, perish the thought, then we may well have a large number of vaccines that we don't have just now.
Thank you. And in terms of this question of the race against the virus, I suppose my question is very much around what have we learned not to make the same mistakes again? And it is that what we know is that by having these lockdowns, you can suppress the virus. We can be successful at doing that. But our lesson of the last time, so they eat out to help out, for example, at the time was hailed by everybody as a success, and it did achieve what it wanted to achieve. However, it's now there's evidence clearly showing that actually it helped lead to the second spread and wave. So what have we learned for that? And this time round, is our approach going to be much more conservative in a sense? How are we going to do that, Minister?
Well, again, I think Jason is better placed than I am, because a lot of this is we discuss in light of the scientific advice. But I think the general point I would make as a layperson, Alec, to you as a layperson, is the biggest lessons that I think I have learned. The first of which is to do with travel, and to do with the fact that last summer we let the virus back in, and that undid the good work that we had all been doing. And the second one is that we have to think this through carefully, very carefully, repeatedly, again and again. The discussions that Cabinet have, the discussions and things we hear from people like Jason, the discussions that we are having here now are about a collective effort to think this through as carefully as we possibly can, and to get as much agreement as we can on the actions we need to take. Now, there will be lessons to do with reduction of viruses, reduction of vaccines, which you think that the way in which we react to scientific advice, the way we weight the harms that can be done, and that is a very, very important issue, to recognize the various harms, not just the vitally important is the medical harm, and the consequences of actions. I referred to at the very beginning today the regulation we're looking at, where it's not just about, though that's vitally important, making sure that people are not homeless at this terribly difficult time or ever, but also the fact that there are consequences of people mixing, for example, if they become homeless, which can be an ancillary problem, but it's a problem that's going to spread the virus. So it's immensely complicated, it's immensely difficult, and it is only made slightly easier, but it is made slightly easier if we have a common front and we work together on it. But Jason,
I agree with all of that, and Mr. Rowley, it's an excellent question. We have learned a great deal about the science of this particular virus around the world, and you can see every country struggling with the sweet spot of opening versus safety measures, and no country has got that perfectly right. I think travel is crucial. We've discussed that already this morning. I think we have things in our favour. Vaccination is definitely in our favour. New research this week, which we might come to if somebody asks about how that works. But something against us, and that is new variant of vaccine, which has now become the variant in Scotland, and that will continue to happen. So we've got trouble, but we've also got advantage because science is helping us. The testing is improving. Our lateral flow testing didn't exist last summer. Now it does exist. It's not entirely reliable, but it's better than it was last summer, and it will continue to improve. The public health advice is go slow. Now that's easy for me to say, but we've also got to think about the other harms, which is what Mr. Russell just brought us back to. We've got to think about what those other harms are, which is why early learning and childcare, P1 to P3, seems to me to be the right thing to do, slowly and gradually, and then there's going to be a conversation about what's next and what's next. My inbox, I bet like yours, Mr. Ehrlich, is already filling with people who want to open their sector because the virus doesn't transmit in their sector. And I've been at this movie a number of times before.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Alec. Our next questions come from Mark Ruskell. Mark.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning to you both. I was listening into the briefing on Monday, and I think Dr. Smith talked about the in relation to the vaccination program. I just wanted to ask you how much of that customer experience is really discretionary, how much of it is essential, and does it have a bearing on the throughput, on the numbers of people that we can get through the vaccination centres so that we can start to catch up with some other areas in the UK? I mean, are we looking effectively at needing a sort of an oldie style of customer experience rather than a Waitrose?
It's a really important question, and it relates to other questions that have been asked, such as, how far do you need to travel? What's a different experience you would have if, like me, you live in a rural area compared to somebody who lives in a city and may go to a mass centre. There's never going to be a mass centre in Glendalough, because there isn't a mass of people in Glendalough, and therefore you have to operate differently. I think it's related also to a wider question, which Jason has a great deal of experience on before COVID, and there was indeed a period before COVID, bizarre as it sometimes is to think that, and that is the way in which we operate and Scotland operates its health service and how we relate to the people whom it serves. And Jason's done a lot of talking about that and with the type of health service we have globally. So I think he should reflect upon that.
I think it's a crucial question, and I think it's a balance. And there is an argument about who gets the balance right or wrong, Mr. Ruskell, and I'm not here to defend whether we get it right or wrong. I'm going to use a story to tell you, though. My mum is 80 and was in priority group 1, got a call from a nurse she knows, went to the surgery she knows. My dad parked in the car park they know. They went upstairs they know, and they met the nurse, smiled at the nurse, both got their vaccine and came home. It was a person-centred, good experience. Now, the age group below them is going to Airdrie Town Hall. So they would have tolerated Airdrie Town Hall. That wouldn't have been something they wouldn't have done. But the question is where that sweet spot is. So what we decided to do was do care homes, health and social care workers, and that over 80s group as close to home as we could. And that, in the main, was GP practices. In Highland, still GP practices because of the rurality. Mr. Russell will almost certainly get his in a GP practice once we get to his group. Then the younger age group being asked to travel to Airdrie Town Hall or even to the Louisa Jordan or the EICC. And you can see that in the graph over the last 3 weeks. You can see a gradual increase and then a very sudden increase as we get both supply and we get down to those lower age groups. So I think that was the right choice for that person-centred group of the over 80s. Others may disagree. They may have wanted a more industrial version of vaccination for that group, but that's what we did.
Okay. Do you think the gaps then will start to narrow between Scotland and the rest of the UK?
I do. I think they will narrow around supply. The constraint has always been, but the constraint increasingly will become supply. But I think you'll find that in the main, I mean, if you want to look on the edge, you'll find difference. In the main, everybody will meet those same targets of end of this week, mid-February, end of February, roughly for those for those groupings that we've gone through with the JCVI. Then it gets a little more complex because we're beginning then to do second doses and first doses. So supply becomes a little bit more challenging because you've got to hold back enough for second doses because we want to do them within 12 weeks and continue the first dose. And that will depend a bit, like Mr. Rowley's question earlier, that will depend on other vaccines coming on stream, which we can't accurately rely on yet. So we have to do that based on AZ and Pfizer, and then we'll think about what's coming next. So I think we will align, and I think you can see that beginning to happen in the last few days.
Yeah. Okay. An issue was raised with me by somebody who's working at a test centre managed by Mighty. They were concerned because I think 3/4 of the staff had contracted COVID. They were very worried about infection control measures being managed by Mighty and how they were not supporting staff effectively at this test centre as well. I just wondered if that's something that you're aware of. Have you had reports of this? And specifically, do you know how many staff have actually contracted COVID working at test centres?
That is a question for Jason Leach. I would not have that knowledge.
Yeah, so it's not something that's come to my attention, Mr. Ruskell, not in any big way, other than I get news each day of outbreaks. So I get a big table of all the outbreaks, and there have been a number, quite small, around test centres. I don't have the number of people who got it. I wonder if that individual or you might want to write in about that specific one, and we can, of course, investigate that with the local health protection team. That shouldn't. We will get. Of course, there will be occasional positives in a workplace, and that is a workplace. But it should be done absolutely as safely as possible, and we will endeavour to check that is happening. And if that's a training problem, or if that's a training for Mighty problem, then we'll absolutely deal with it.
Okay, appreciate that. A final question is just returning to a subject that we debated in Parliament yesterday about self-isolation support. And I think one of the points that was raised by the Cabinet Secretary and others in that debate was around the effectiveness and the consistency around the local assistance service that's in place to help people self-isolate, whether this is really getting through to excluded groups and those who actually need it, particularly in terms of accommodation. I just wonder, it's a subject we've talked about a lot in this committee, and I'm wondering how we can get a grip on the effectiveness of that service in terms of data, figures, information coming through, rather than people having to put in FOI requests, try and find out exactly what's happening on the ground. It'd be good if we could get a metric, something we can really focus in on.
I agree. I think it would be good to make sure that we have as much information as possible about how the system is working so that we can constantly improve it. I think just last week you asked me about these issues, and we've made some progress in the last few days on these issues. And I'm sure further progress can be made. I think in the light of yesterday's debate and the fact that this was discussed yesterday, I think I'd want to take some cognizance of the debate and also see what ideas have come up through the debate. I didn't sit through the entire debate as clearly it was responded to, I think, by Shirley-Ann Somerville, was it, rather than by myself. So I would want to see where we are with that, but I'm certainly not ruling it out. And if we can find a way to do it, we should do it, as we've said repeatedly on this issue.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Our next questions come from Willie Rennie.
Thanks, convener. This is probably for Jason. The front page of the Guardian newspaper today. It's based on some research by Dr. James Dodd at Bristol University, and he's talking about aerosol generation, particularly from the cough, that it might be much higher than previously thought, and therefore spreading the virus in hospital environments to a much greater extent. It said that the cough is 10 times more infectious aerosol than speaking or breathing. And the general wards, rate of infection in them compared with ICU is double because they assume they've got less protection. And I've been encouraging the Health Secretary to change the the regulations on the supply of masks and PPE for nurses, because currently it's only surgical masks in these particular environments that aren't involved in aerosol generating procedures as they're currently classed. Is that something that he's read, the research, and would he advise any change to the guidance for PPE?
I haven't seen it. I will look at it today, though, Mr. Rennie. And my answer is fundamentally that we have rooms of clever people who make those judgments. And for PPE, it's UK-wide, and it's led by the Chief Nursing Officers on behalf of all of us. And they looked very recently with Public Health England and Public Health Scotland at that PPE advice, and they decided, with the knowledge they had at that moment, and of course science can change, that the PPE advice for health and social care and for the general population, which was one of the questions they were being asked, was absolutely appropriate. If there is new evidence, then they of course will take that into account. This isn't a matter of money or supply, actually. It's a matter of what's appropriate to keep the disease at bay for the population at risk. So if that changes, the advice will change. I haven't seen anything that suggests to me that advice should change, but I'll be very, very happy to look at that and make sure it's included in the CNO's considerations, but they'll already be on it.
Yeah. That's particularly helpful. I've got some exercised NHS staff who contact me regularly about this, and they're particularly concerned within the last few days. We've seen the number of infections in hospitals with patients has shot up for COVID in respect of COVID infections. I've got a number of quick questions around about some details. Do we know actually how many NHS staff in Scotland have died from the virus and how many have been off work because of the virus? Do we collect those statistics? And if so, can they be published? The Minister referred to the fact that we eliminated the virus last summer. I've not seen that research. Is there research being published for that, and can that be made available? Just two quick questions on those things.
If I use the word eliminated, I use the word in error. It was massively reduced. Elimination has a particular meaning, and that's not, I think, what I either said or meant to say. My apologies. It is, it was massively reduced. Now we're in a different situation, but I must let Jason answer the rest of that.
So we do know how many health and social care workers have died, Mr. Rennie. I think we have said that before. It's low, and therefore we have to be very cautious statistically because of that, and we're under strong guidance from the statistical regulators about identification, about where they are and all of that. But we will get back to you on that number. Sickness rates for COVID, we also do know. That's slightly complex because it is everything to do with COVID. So it might be self-isolating because your kid has COVID, or self-isolating because somebody in your family has COVID. But that sickness rate is known in the health and social care system, and I think published, but I'll also check that one for you. We didn't eliminate the virus, no country has, but Mr. Russell's right. We got to days when we were announcing single-figure positive test results, and 17s and 12s and 14s. Now, they are, of course, the tip of the iceberg, and there are more people with the virus than those numbers. We know that today. If there are 900 yesterday, 700 yesterday, we know there are more than that in the community. But the fact is that in May, June, July, we got the numbers down very, very low.
Okay, so that's what the First Minister refers to yesterday, was the numbers from last summer, because she seemed to imply she had further evidence or research on this that showed we had got down to almost elimination.
I think there's two. Sorry.
No, carry on.
I think there's two pieces of evidence there. There's the piece of evidence that is the daily prevalence data, and that then goes into the lag indicators, the hospital admissions, the ICU admissions, and the deaths. So we announced, forgive the slightly impersonal nature of this, 0 deaths for a number of weeks. during that process with a few odd days with single figures. The other piece of evidence in there, which is published, is the genomics data about the beginning of the second wave. And we know that the vast majority of the viral strains in the beginning of wave 2 were new to Scotland. They hadn't been included in wave 1. And the genomics very cleverly lets us do that. So that is published. There's been 2 big genomic studies, one of the wave 1 genomics and one of the beginnings of the wave 2 genomics. And those, there are some commonalities, but the vast majority of wave 2 were not in Scotland in wave 1. And that's the other reason we know we got to very low numbers.
So that information is public?
Yep, that's absolutely public. I can get you again, but yes, it's public.
So one final question, Convener. It's about the flu vaccine. I won't go into too much of the arguments that we've had this week about it, but some practical questions. So the clinically extremely vulnerable, those letters have definitely gone out this week or are going out this week. That's the first question. And the second question is, people who worry that they've been missed out, what is the mechanism to make sure that they haven't been missed out? Because when they phone the number, they're just given general information. How do they make sure they're back on the list? Now, not all the letters have gone out, I appreciate that, but once all the letters technically have gone out, how does somebody make sure they get on the list?
Okay, I want Jason to address the detail of this because I think it's really important. But of course, the First Minister again said yesterday there is, of course, a role for constituency and for other MSPs. If people are distressed and feel they have been completely forgotten and they have not had a letter, and over 80s at this stage would clearly be in that position, then that can be raised and should be raised by constituency members, sometimes directly with GPs, sometimes with health board who may need help. But let us not rehearse. If we wouldn't agree on it, let us not rehearse some of the arguments we've had in this week that say if people are in that position and genuinely feel in that position, then of course people will step in and help them. But also, it is really important to remember that there's a window in which this is happening. Not all the vaccine is delivered on a Monday morning and synchronized to be used by Monday afternoon. There are issues of supply, there are issues of rurality, there are issues of different places operating at different speeds. That all has to be factored in. Nobody doubts that everybody wants this to go as well as it possibly can. And everybody is working on that. But Jason might want to just add in terms of the detail.
I think it's a really important question, Mr. Rennie. My inbox is as full as yours, I'm sure, of people who say my 74-year-old neighbour has had a letter and they've had their vaccine and I'm 79 and nobody's spoken to me yet. The fact is we're batching people together, and it would be lovely to do it alphabetically by year of birth, but that would have been slightly overly complex. If you are over 80 and you haven't had a vaccine by Friday, you should phone your GP. That group, very straightforward. If you are clinically extremely vulnerable or over 70, you should wait. There is still 2 weeks to go. So you will not have been contacted yet, perhaps. Many have, and hundreds of thousands have. But if you are in that group and you haven't heard yet, you should wait. And I know that's really difficult advice because you just want to know you're on a list somewhere. But we will get to you. There will, of course, be some admin errors in there, people whose names are wrong, people whose dates of birth are wrong, people who have moved house, perhaps. So when that happens, health boards will make contact available. And now that in Highland will probably be the GP practices because they're doing all the over 70s. But in Glasgow, that will be the vaccine coordinator for Glasgow. So it will be your individual health board that sets up some kind of process for you to be caught up with. But for now, hard though it is, the advice is just be patient. Now, I had to deal with this with my own mum and dad, who were in that over 80s group, who every day were saying, are we on a list, are we on a list, are we on a list? Tuesday, they get a call, vaccinated on the Wednesday. So that's the advice for now.
Thank you, Convener. That's fine.
Thank you, Willie. Our next questions come from Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning again, Cabinet Secretary and Professor Leach. A couple of questions from me again this morning. I wonder if I could ask Cabinet Secretary about the hospitality sector, if I may. I was speaking just the other day to Stephen Montgomery from the Hospitality Group, and also Kenny Blair from Buzzworks in Ayrshire, and Mario Gizzi from the DRG Group in Glasgow, and the guys were asking if the government is thinking about what a safe return to the hospitality sector might look like, and could they participate in that with us? They're very supportive, of course, but they're obviously keen to be able to open up whenever they can, to work with us to make sure that that is done safely. So they're keen to be involved in it, Cabinet Secretary, and I just wondered if I could have your thoughts on that too, please.
Well, I would, of course, encourage all of those with real expertise and knowledge of how things can be done to be involved in the planning and the taking forward of it. And, I would say to you as their constituency or as their local MSP, you should be saying that to the minister responsible, who in this case would be Fergus Ewing, and making it absolutely clear to Fergus that people who know lots of things, and they should be involved in their planning it, and that's a great idea. Of course, what we would like to see happen, the parameters around that will be partly what they were last year, and partly from what we've learned from last year in terms of what takes place. But I long for the time when we can say, yes, this is what we're about to start up with, and begin to get back to that. But we're not there yet, and we've also got to balance that. Because if we were to say to people, we think that 3 weeks come Wednesday we can start to do this, already our guard is slipping, and our guard must not slip. So the war is welcome to it. I mean, you have people who have knowledge. Those people should be put into it. Scotland's a small country, but equally we're not there yet.
Okay, that's quite helpful. Thanks for that. I'll be in touch with Fergus as soon as I can. I wonder if I could ask a couple of questions to Professor Leach. First one, Jason, you mentioned earlier on there's new research, good news about new research if somebody asks. So can I ask, what is the good news about the new research?
So I've been waiting for it because I sat up till midnight last night reading 37 pages of AstraZeneca's preprint in the Lancet. So I was hoping somebody would ask. So brace you might all want to go for coffee. It could be 40 minutes. No, there are two fundamental pieces of good news in that research. The first is that the AstraZeneca vaccine protects you from serious disease. So 17,000 people in the trial, half get vaccine, half don't. In the half that get the vaccine, there were no hospital admissions. In the half that don't get the vaccine, there were 17 hospital admissions for COVID. So that's a very serious, you need to be quite sick to be hospitalised. The layer underneath that is probably even more interesting. So they did weekly tests on everybody, vaccinated and non-vaccinated. And within that group, there are, of course, some people who still get the virus. They don't get serious illness, but even the vaccinated group, they get it. And it was something like 17 people, maybe a little bit more, and 84 people in the control group, the non-vaccinated group, which gives you 67% protection, which is really, really high for a vaccine so early in its journey. So that's why we're now saying we think this is early evidence that transmission is being prevented by this vaccine. They didn't specifically test transmission. To do that, you'd have to check households. You'd have to test all the people in the households for the positives, etc. But it would appear that the really good news now is that the AstraZeneca vaccine, and therefore by inference the other vaccines, do prevent transmission to some extent. The third piece of good news, briefly, is that the gap, in fact, gives you more protection. So it would appear that the 12-week gap between first dose and second dose, exactly as the boffins told us from the Joint Committee, actually boosts your immune response better than a 3-week dose. So as they suggested would happen, now proved in this paper, certainly in trial data. Remember, we still need to see this in the wild in mass population testing, but very, very encouraging data.
That is really, really encouraging. Thank you so much for that. I wonder if I could just a final query to you, Professor Leach about the Ayrshire and Arran picture. There's a little bit of confusion, let's say, down here about the who was being vaccinated by mid-February. Are you able to clarify that for us, particularly for some of my elderly constituents? Are we definitely doing all the over 70s, and are we trying our best to do the over 65s by mid-February in Ayrshire and Arran?
So health boards are making judgments about their volume, both of supply and of what their population age range is. So in Ayrshire and Arran, they've made really, really good progress, and they are calling for as many over 65s as they hope to be able to get through by mid-February. So the target for the nation, in fact, for all 4 UK nations, is the over 70s group plus the clinically extremely vulnerable by mid-February. So that is on track everywhere, whether you're in the Western Isles or Ayrshire. The next step is the over 65. So we've told boards that if you have supply and you can get to those people without the 70-year-olds being put back, then batter on, for lack of a better expression. And that's what Ayrshire and Arran are doing. So they've sent, I know, a lot of letters out to the 65-plus group. I'm not sure if they're going to get to them all by mid-February. If they can, they will. So just be patient. You don't have to be done by mid-February, but we would hope to get to you.
That's really good. That's good news. Thanks so much for that. Back to you, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you, Willie. Our next questions come from Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, colleagues, and to the Cabinet Secretary and to Professor Leach. Picking up on the really important issue of international travel and the mandatory quarantine proposals, and taking into account that as we move from where we are, which is lockdown, to hopefully sunnier climes and sunny uplands, the issue of international travel becomes even more important, as has been already discussed this morning, and reference to the report that this committee certainly is well aware of in terms of the impact of travel post the position we were succeeding in obtaining in July last year, which was very, very, very low transmission. But turning to the First Minister's statement this week, she, in my view, because I also had raised it last week at committee, rightly made the point that we need a vigorous approach, a comprehensive approach to this if we are to be serious about it. And that is what she is proposing within the competences of our Parliament in terms of direct travel to Scotland. Obviously, there's the issue of travel from other parts of the UK, from third countries into Scotland. The First Minister said, Cabinet Secretary, that discussions were continuing with the UK government to encourage them, to urge them to seek this more logical, rational, rigorous, comprehensive approach. Could the Cabinet Secretary update the committee on where those discussions currently stand? Thank you.
Well, I believe they're ongoing, which is a word that simply means they've not yet come to their conclusion. The issue is quite clear. If you're going to do this, you need to do it, in our view, comprehensively. That means it affects everyone coming from everywhere, essentially, and it does not have the potential to be less restrictive in that, and therefore the possibility of it not being as effective as it needs to be. So that's a simple issue. And we believe that those decisions should be based on and need to be based on scientific and clinical evidence. And we believe they also need to be based on experience. So we've had the experience of seeing what happens. The optimism is not in place. Jason has already indicated today that we want to make sure that this works and works effectively, and it would be desirable to have as much agreement as possible. We would like that to happen, but it also has to be done in a way that we are legally able to do so, but also we believe is effective. That's what we're going to try and do, but we'd rather do it together. Jason might just want to say a word or two about where he believes the discussions are, because I know they're not concluded, and we do want to try and get it right. And we are also in that position that he has indicated of exporting rather than importing at the moment. And we need to get this in place before we are anywhere close to importing.
It's absolutely right. If you saw the BBC News report last night, I don't know if the number was accurate, but they suggested 15,000 people arrived from international destinations into the UK yesterday. Now, for now, that's probably not a huge risk because of the level of our prevalence, but that will become a big risk when the prevalence begins to fall, particularly when we can't find variants. The South African variant is impossible to find without genomic study, and therefore you don't know if it's in Amsterdam and you don't know if it's in Paris because they don't do as much genomics as us. So people could easily go from Johannesburg to Doha to the UK in some form, and we wouldn't know that variant would come. But almost more important than the present variants are future variants. And until we protect the whole world, we won't know what that is going to do. So I don't think my views have been opaque to this committee over the last few weeks around what the public health advice is around travel. And I would say if Orkney get to single figure numbers, we should protect Orkney from importation from the Scottish mainland. If Scotland gets to low numbers, we should protect Scotland from importation. If the UK gets to low numbers, we should protect the UK from importation. And if we can get both islands and our surrounding islands to low numbers, we should protect that whole 5 countries. And we should do that using vaccination restrictions to our population and importation restrictions.
It might help, Annabel Ewing, if I just gave some figures, because figures are published, I think, every Wednesday on this. The last figures of which we have, I have available to me, though presumably yesterday's figures will now be available, was the weekend, the week ending 31/01/2021, which would be the figures of the most recent figures. 4,651 people arriving in Scotland in that period, which 3,562 were quarantining. Now, you know, that is comparatively low numbers if you think of the numbers of people arriving in Scotland by air, you know, before the vaccines, indeed, but we will require to be ever more vigilant as we move from exporting to importing.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary and Professor Leach for their comprehensive and helpful answers. I just wonder, and I probably would direct this to the Cabinet Secretary because I can appreciate that Professor Leach probably wouldn't want to answer this particular question, but Cabinet Secretary, do you have a lot of confidence that the UK Tory government actually has a handle on what the issues are here? Because we saw the rather sorry spectacle this week of the UK Tory Transport Secretary Grant Shapps giving evidence to the House of Commons Transport Select Committee, where on dealing with this key issue and on the issue potentially of closing borders, he stated that it was, and I quote, an island nation unlike Australia. So I just wonder, given his apparent lack of grasp of basic geography, do we feel in Scotland that we can have confidence that the UK Tory government really gets what the issues are here, Cabinet Secretary?
I'm never reluctant to mix it politically, as Annabel Ewing knows, but I'm going to resist the temptation on this occasion, and I hope she'll forgive me for doing it. I think we need to try and get to a situation where there is an agreement, and therefore I'm not going to say anything that jeopardizes that agreement. I am very critical of some of the things I've seen in recent days from UK government ministers who, in my view, have been mixing it politically in places they shouldn't have been mixing it politically. And I think I have to resist the temptation to do that. So Grant Shapps' knowledge of geography neither surprises me or makes me anything other than being what I would expect. But the reality is we need to get a solution to this, and it needs to be driven by scientific and clinical evidence. And I'm listening, but that's not nearly as important as the First Minister listening, Jean Freeman listening, and trying to get this solution. And let's see if we can get the solution, as you know, the Welsh are trying to do, as well as everybody is trying to do. So let's see whether we can get it. And I'm sure she will forgive me for not doing what she might expect me to do.
I would always expect the Cabinet Secretary to be his normal diplomatic self, Convener. One last brief area of questioning for Professor Leach. If I mean, picking up on this good news story of yesterday. I mean, I hear what Professor Leach says. I have not read the 30+ pages of the Lancet, so I will take what he says and his particular knowledge of the subject matters being discussed. But I do wonder, when we understand this data is likely to be peer-reviewed, and indeed on the broader issue, when we expect to see sort of in real-time verification of these studies. I'm sure there will be more to come put out, particularly by the manufacturers of the particular vaccines. And I understand that we would need to see population health studies in real time to back these claims up, which we all want to believe in, don't get me wrong, but we want to have real hope and not false hope. So perhaps Professor Leach could indicate on the wider issues how we can have confidence that the data produced by, or further to the commissioning of the pharmaceutical companies, is something that we can all absolutely believe in.
Yeah, so this paper, yesterday's paper, comes from a thing called the Oxford Vaccination Group, which is linked to AstraZeneca, of course, but is not AstraZeneca. It is Oxford University Academics, and it is peer-reviewed and published. What we mean by preprint is it comes quicker. So because it's so important, the Lancet will do a fast review and put it out rather than the slightly longer-winded version where they would send it to the likes of me and 4 others. We would criticise it, and 3 months later they would revise it and it would get back out. So it still has to go through that version of the process, but it is reviewed in the sense that the numbers are checked, the conclusions are checked against the numbers. So it's not just the views of the academics. It is published by the Lancet, and they have a fast review process to get to there. So you can trust the numbers, and you can trust the conclusions from the numbers. The second point of your question, though, is we also do need real-life vaccination data. This is still trial data, where we're going to people's houses, they've had the vaccine, we've checked the demographic, and we then do a PCR test for each one of them. That will only come, of course, as we vaccinate more people. But we have trials ongoing in the UK, in Israel, in particular for Pfizer, across the world where vaccination is ramping up to check the efficacy in the real world, which we will, of course, expect to be less than in the trial data. It always is. Convener, I wonder if I can just do one other quick thing, because I used the wonders of technology to check something in an answer to Mr. Rennie. And the answer I've had back is that all MSPs will get a letter tomorrow on how to contact each health board when somebody, if they haven't been contacted by their drop-dead date, by their date for their vaccine, what to tell constituents they should do next. I thought that might be helpful for
you. Well, that information is very helpful, and thank you also for answering my questions. That's me, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you, Annabelle, and thank you also, Professor Leach, for that information. Our next question has come from Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. Can I address this to the Cabinet Secretary? I met yesterday with my local GP surgery, and they expressed extreme concerns, and this is Helensburgh Medical Centre, that the supply of vaccines to GPs is very poor. When they plan for a session of vaccination to go out, say, at a weekend on, say, Saturday, and they book the hall and everything else, they don't know until the Friday if they're actually going to have stock of vaccine. Now, this is not good enough. I'm due to have mine actually on Sunday, so I hope that there is vaccine there. Can you like to answer that, Cabinet Secretary, first on the matter of this business of supply of vaccine, because it seems to be hopeless at the moment, and they're very frustrated.
I think I would just say use of language in responding to Annabelle Ewing. I might say to Mr. Corrie, perhaps the use of the word hopeless when over 600,000 people have been vaccinated is perhaps less of an accurate use of language than might one hope for. I want Jason Leach to address it because Jason Leach knows the intricacies of the delivery system. But the constraining factor from the very beginning, and indeed confirmed by no less a figure than the UK vaccine minister, the constraining factor is the supply of vaccine. And that is a UK issue, and I'm not blaming anybody for that. It is a UK issue, and it is a constraining factor. But I think Jason should say a word or two about that. But I would counsel anybody to say we should be encouraging the good practice, and where there are difficulties, we should be endeavouring to solve those difficulties. For example, in the Highlands and Islands, and I don't represent Helensburgh, of course, but in the Highlands and Islands, we've had an exceptionally efficient rollout. And I know GPs have thought that. I know that the Health Board has thought that. And I know journalists and commentators have thought that, because I was on Radio Highland, I think, yesterday morning talking about it. But perhaps Jason would like to say a word or two about the actual technicalities of supply to see if that could assist the Helensburgh practice.
Could I come in there, Cabinet Secretary, before Jason Leach speaks? This has not just happened once or twice. This has come from the hearts of the GPs and their managers trying to get supplies. And only yesterday he confirmed to me there's exactly the same problem. They just cannot rely on it. Now, like it or not, that's the situation, Cabinet Secretary. And hence I'm saying it needs to be sorted.
And I agree with you. And that's why I'm trying to get Jason Leach to tell you about the nature of the supply difficulties, if there are any. And of course, you as an MSP will want to intervene on that to see if you can help the surgery to do so. So you can help do so. So perhaps Jason Leach would like to answer that.
I would, of course, help that practice offline if we possibly can. There are supply challenges, so I don't think this is bad people just not telling them what they haven't got. The vaccine is hard to transport, particularly if it's Pfizer, and supply is not always reliable. It's lumpy. And therefore, Highland Health Board, which I think is Helensburgh, correct me if I'm wrong, Highland Health Board are doing it principally through GP practices. There is a vaccine coordinator at NHS Highland, and that vaccine coordinator will be very happy to speak to that practice. I'm sure they've done that. And it's a big geographical area. It's a big logistical challenge. But we should be able to give them more notice than the day before. You're absolutely right. And we would hope to be able to correct that. And finally, I hope you do get your vaccine on Sunday. I hope that goes well.
Can I just say, Professor Leach, this is the AstraZeneca one, which obviously is not so complicated to transport. We're not talking about the other ones, okay? So there should be no reason for delay.
Well, there could still be reason for delay. There isn't the big freezer reason for delay. But the vials still comes in packs that are probably too big for the Helensburgh practice because we don't want waste. So there are still challenges in there, but you're right, it's easier than the Pfizer one. You're absolutely right. Now, the question there is, how many does Highland think it's getting? When does it know it's getting them? And then when can it tell Helensburgh? I think that should be faster than 24 hours. I think you're correct.
But coming back on that point, I mean, the GP said to me yesterday, so we know there are 500,000 piles of vaccine in store somewhere. I mean, surely there should be no reason for any delays at all.
So I don't know how the GP knows that. I don't know there are 500,000 stored in a warehouse somewhere. I don't think that's true. There are a series of steps in the process. Some are at the manufacturer, some are with the UK-wide distribution centre, and some are in Health Board distribution centres. That's true. There is, of course, stock in order for us to supply to the people who are getting the letters in Ayrshire and Arden, in Helensburgh, in the next little while. But your point is, I come back to accept your point, and we should try and resolve it for that specific practice.
Thank you. Can I ask a second question? And it's a follow-on from my one last week, which was to do the teachers and support staff vaccinations. How are we getting on with that progress in getting them vaccinated, Professor Leach? Particularly for additional support need teachers, or do you mean all teachers and support staff? Particularly additional support needs, the ones who are physically in and manning the hubs at the moment. That's the point. Sorry, just to clarify.
So we're not going to vaccinate any professional groupings ahead of the JCVI group until we've finished the over 50s, except health and social care workers. And social care workers includes additional support need workers who deal with a specific group of children where AGPs, the aerosol generating procedures and others are generated. But the risk here is about the vulnerability of the individual that is cared for, not the vulnerability of the individual who's doing the caring. So the JCVI are very clear. As we've said many times here, The vaccination programme is about risk of death. And therefore, bluntly, people who are more at risk of death go first. And when we get to when we're done with the over 50s, then the JCVI may or may not give us advice about professional prioritisation within this younger group, and then we will take that advice. If they don't give us advice and they say, just you can do whatever you think is right, then we will make judgments and the politicians will decide.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Thank you, both of you. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Our next set of questions come from John Mason.
Thanks so much, Convener. We're using the phrase mid-February quite a lot, and we're obviously approaching that now. So I wonder if is it possible to pin down what that means? Is it the 14th, or would it be, say, Friday the 19th?
I really don't have a view on that. I think February means if you were to get to Friday the 19th and you hadn't heard, then I think that what Jason is talking about in terms of activating the processes is important. But it is perfectly conceivable that on, I think it's a Sunday, whilst vaccination will be going on, it may still be, your letters might still be, the final letters might be working their way to the remoter parts. So I think people should just have a reasonable view that they will be got to, but if they get to the stage and during that week that they feel have not been got to, and the MSPs are being advised on how they should activate those concerns, they might want to activate them.
I agree. There will be a margin within that, because remember, no group will be 100% for a variety of reasons. Some people will refuse. Some people, it's inappropriate to vaccinate them. So we won't get to 100% for any group, except health and social care workers, where we have got to 100%, which is testament to their willingness to come forward. But even in care homes, where some people are very close to end of life, there have been a very small number of people who have refused or had the vaccine refused on their behalf by their power of attorney individual. So 98% is extraordinarily high for care home vaccination. So I think as we go down the ages, most of the literature suggests as we go down the ages that refusal group will increase, unfortunately. But at least we get high numbers in those who are most vulnerable. So there will be a margin somewhere in that week in February. I think you're right, Mr. So I would have thought, be patient until the 19th, and then after the 19th, there will be a way of contacting somebody.
Yeah, thank you for that. It helps with speaking to constituents, because some of them are on edge, let's say. Second point, we talked before about the question of mixing vaccines, and I think the answer at that point was that that was being examined or researched. And I think I heard something in the media that there was positive thoughts about mixing vaccines, probably for Jason Leach, but are we any further on this point?
But we're only further on in the sense that the trial has been announced. So now that we have 2 approved vaccines and we've got good evidence of efficacy, we have now started UK-wide. It's going to be English sites, actually, announced last night. We're going to do the mixing vaccine trial. So 4 or 5 different groups. One group will get 2 doses of AstraZeneca, one group will get 2 doses of Pfizer, and then every combination from there downwards. So you might get AstraZeneca first, Pfizer second. Most of the virology and immunologists instinctively think that won't be a problem, but we're not going to do it until the trial proves it's not a problem. We already do booster doses for other vaccines with a different manufacturer. Nobody checks which manufacturer it is before they go for their typhoid booster or their rabies booster if they're travelling. So we think the vaccines will probably interact just as well as previous vaccines, but we want to know that for sure, particularly because of the mRNA vaccine, the new technology that the Pfizer vaccine is. So that trial starts now and we'll report in a few weeks' time.
Thanks very much again, that's helpful. And then the third area I wanted to touch on is back to the schools and the children. I mean, as you probably know, I mean, some people think we're sending the schools back too quickly, but there's clearly parents who think that the schools should all be back immediately. and they tend to emphasise the mental health of children. Now, this is Young People's Mental Health Week, I think, and clearly mental health is important. And I just wonder, from either of you, how do we balance that between the children's mental health and at the same time, obviously, we're very interested in the physical health because of COVID. Can you say anything about how we get that balance right?
Well, there is no algorithm which would drive us to say, if X is true, then Y has to be true. What we would very much do is, the detail that these decisions, the recommendations on these decisions, or the views on these decisions come from a variety of specialists and specialist groups. Mr. Swinney is actively involved in those. They would treat very, very seriously the evidence that they have and the information they have on mental health harms. They would treat very seriously the information they have on the harms to educational attainment and the widening, if there is one, of the attainment gap. All of those things would be, I'm sure I've not been present at the education group, but would be very, very seriously considered by that group. And when in the end that comes to Cabinet alongside the views of scientific advisors in terms of the pandemic and the spread of the virus on the R number, those matters would all be discussed and considered very carefully. And it's a matter then of judgment, I have to say. I mean, the First Minister said this repeatedly. It is a matter of judgment, of trying to set one set of harms against another. There is no harm-free way of doing this. There are economic harms, there are harms to parents' mental health. I mean, I don't think that can be discounted. The frustration, annoyance, difficulty, anguish that this can cause. So they are treated very seriously, and it is a judgment of those involved who make the decisions. In the end, that has to be the Cabinet, and the lead ministers. It is their judgment that will count. And I can only say that it's treated incredibly seriously, and all those factors are treated incredibly seriously, and nobody comes away thinking, gosh, that was obvious or that was easy. It's never easy. Jason might want to say more because he's from another part of that process.
Yeah, one of the reasons why pretty much all school buildings are now open for, let's in shorthand call them vulnerable children and key worker children is precisely that, Mr. Mason. That in lockdown number 1, we opened hubs and only about 1 or 2% of children went. So the Education Recovery Group, which is a mixture of public health and education, remember, it's broad, and their advice is not just about COVID harm, it's about well-being and broader harms. And the balance is so hard to strike, and there isn't a sweet spot that you can find, unfortunately. You have to make a judgment, and the advice is based on what we think is the right thing to do, hence the reason why the educationalist advice is if we say we're comfortable with some children coming back, which children do you think should come back? That's not a judgment for me as a public health advisor, it's a judgment for those educationalists, those experts. They say bring back the younger kids first. So we accept that, we give that advice to Cabinet, the Cabinet then take it. The other thing I would add is we've tried to put wraparound services in for mental health services, both in those schools, virtually, and then for the higher end inside the health and social care system. And that has worked relatively well. CAMHS waiting lists haven't soared like some people suggested they would. In fact, virtual consultations have gone quite well. Not for everybody, not universal, but they've got through quite a lot of cases and done really well. And the schools have got better, I think, in this version of opening at keeping in touch with the children. The digital infrastructure is better. People are, certainly from my dining room table, where there is a high school teacher often, it's much more engaging with the kids than it was in lockdown number 1.
Thanks, Convener. That's very helpful.
Thank you. Finally, we turn to Stuart McMillan, please.
Thank you, Convener. Just a couple of questions. The first one is, it was reported in the Herald today that the General Secretary of the Scottish Secondary Teachers Association was concerned about secondary schools going back too soon. Can I just clarify that actually were all the teaching unions actually involved in the discussions prior to the announcement this week?
I couldn't confirm or deny that because I don't know, but what I can certainly do is make sure that you are informed of that by the Education Secretary. But I couldn't confirm or deny that. But I quite clearly, having been an Education Secretary, I'm aware of the fact that the unions are all involved all the time in terms of discussing education. But that particular detail, I'm sorry, Mr. Miller, I don't have.
No, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Just a couple of questions regarding the £500 the payment. Really just to clarify, are Scottish Ambulance staff eligible for that, and also agency staff in health boards?
As far as I understand it, the eligibility is to do with the income level, and therefore, I presume anybody who falls within the income level category would get it. But again, I would want to have that confirmed, and we'll make sure we confirm it with you.
Okay, thank you. This week, the committee received the report and also the shortened version from the Scottish Fiscal Commission. And in section 1.11, the Scottish Fiscal Commission are very clear about the Scottish Government's limitations in terms of borrowing powers. And I'll read this one sentence. It states, "The Scottish Government has requested additional flexibilities from the UK Government to manage the budget this year. HM Treasury has, as yet, not granted any additional flexibilities." Now, clearly, much of this is because of COVID. Would you strongly recommend that the UK Government actually listen to what's going on in Scotland and act accordingly, so that our Finance Secretary can assist and do the job that's required to help Scotland in the next financial year?
I would strongly recommend that. I've spent the last 4.5 years endeavouring to try and get the UK Government to accept that it should be listening to the reality of devolution and not making assumptions about it. And I would continue to argue that. And if that is the view of the Fiscal Commission, it is also my view. I think it would be the view of any sane and sensible person at this stage.
Thank you. And I think a final question, just regarding, there's an article in the BBC that indicated that last year, in the first quarter, there appeared to be some 54% of applications for funding, COVID funding, apparently was allegedly through fraud. So that was also businesses and also individuals. Are you content, Cabinet Secretary, that the processes that are in place, that also funding going out to local authorities to then go to their local communities, are you content that there has been an improvement in that, in the guidance and also in the regulations to cut down on fraud applications?
There's a fine balance to be struck. We want the money to go out of the door as quickly as possible to those who really need it, and many, many people do need it. You're a constituency MSP as I am, Mr. McMillan. You know the real need that exists out there. And the more barriers we put up, some people will not get what they absolutely need, deserve, and are entitled to. Equally, there are some, I think few, but there are some bad actors who, seeing any circumstance, will try and exploit it. And we must try and stop that happening. But my view is that if we're going to err at all in this, we are on the side of speed and generosity to make sure that the harms that are being done, and there are huge harms being done, are to whatever extent we can do, mitigated financially. So, I certainly wouldn't spend a lot of my time worrying about fraud. Spend a lot more of my time looking at my postbag, and no doubt yours, worrying that we need to do even more and more and more to make sure we put money in people's hands.
Okay. Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Stuart. I just have one final question, which it picks up on something that Jason Leach said earlier about supply and the second dose of the vaccine. And it strikes me that there could be quite a challenging moment in a month's time or so when we are both beginning to vaccinate larger cohorts of people, because we're going down the age ranges, the priority groups. And at the same time, people will be coming back for their second dose, those who've been vaccinated already. Could you reassure the committee that you think that both in terms of supply and logistics that we are ready to deal with that moment?
Well, before Jason meets, I think, gives you the detail on that, can I just say, Convener, I think what you're saying is undoubtedly an important observation, and it proves to me that this is not a sprint, but a marathon. And therefore we can build the solid basis of organisation that allows us to deliver on that marathon. And some of the ways in which this has been approached so far seem to imply it is a sprint. And I think we should step back from that, and we should look at what we are going to need in the medium and long term as well, and build a solid foundation, which indeed is what we have been doing. But Jason might like to say a word or two about the logistics and pressures of what will be a long-term situation, because it is also, I think, expected at the present moment that vaccination may have to continue for a long period of time, in the sense that many of us do, particularly those of us who have aged to do so, and you're not, Convener, but I am, to get a flu jab on an annual basis. And we're going to have to look at those sort of things too. But Jason might like to say more.
It's enormously complex and an excellent question, complicated further by supply challenges such as Pfizer deciding to temporarily close some of its production line in order to move their production line to greater capacity, which is a great thing, but it means that interrupts supply. And we need to give, for now, we need to give Pfizer first dose people Pfizer second dose. So there is modelling across the 4 UK countries for that moment, for when we need to start stockpiling vaccines so that we are sure we can give second doses, because we will prioritise those second doses before we move down through the age groups, because we have to. Now, we're not going to suddenly stop and only do second doses. You're right, Convener, that those two processes are going to run in parallel, but it will mean that we may not be able to run at full capacity simply because of supply, and we will have to hold back until we can get the supply and demand exactly right. Now, all 4 countries are doing that. We're doing it together and separately. I saw the modelling this week. We had a big meeting earlier in the week just with officials, vaccination, suppliers, procurement, all of that. And then we presented that modelling to the Cabinet Secretary for Health and to the First Minister yesterday. So I'm as confident as I can be that we have thought about that. I'm reluctant to be supremely confident, because you just don't know what eventualities could happen. So weather, it's something else could happen to the factories. So we have to be careful, which is why the straight numbers game doesn't fully understand the complexity of this process. The numbers game is absolutely important, because I want to protect as many people as we can, but it is complex.
Thank you very much for that. I think that concludes our consideration of this agenda item, and can I take this opportunity to thank both the Cabinet Secretary and the National Clinical Director for their evidence this morning. We move on to agenda item 2, subordinate legislation. This is consideration of a motion on the subordinate legislation that we have taken evidence on just now. Cabinet Secretary, would you like to make any further remarks on the SSI before we take the motion?
No, thank you.
I now invite the Cabinet Secretary to move motion S5M 23948 that the COVID-19 Committee recommends that the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements Local Level Scotland Amendment Number 14 Regulations 2021, SSI 2021/35 be approved.
Moved.
Does any member wish to speak on the motion? If so, could you please indicate this by typing R in the chat bar? I see that no member has typed R into the chat bar. So could we now put the question on the motion? The question is that motion S5M 23948 be agreed to. Does any member disagree? And if so, please could you type N in the chat bar now? I can see that no member has typed N. There is therefore no division, and I can confirm that the committee is agreed to this motion and the motion is agreed to. The committee will publish a report to Parliament setting out our decision on the statutory instrument considered at this meeting in due course. That concludes our consideration of this agenda item and our time with the Cabinet Secretary. Can I reiterate our thanks to both him and the National Clinical Director for their attendance this morning. As ever, it is very illuminating and helpful. That concludes our business for this meeting. The next committee meeting will take place on Thursday, the 11th of February next week, and the clerks will update members on the arrangements for that meeting in due course. And can I now close the meeting?